Good evening. My name is Bradley Benson. You've never heard of me, and that's not a bad thing. I've spent the last several decades studying and trying to understand some of the threats that are facing America. And over the years, I've called out several of those threats. In the past 8 years or so, we've seen a new rising threat called BRICS and the New Development Bank. Now, the culmination of this threat is through an action that they're taking called de-dollarization, which is making major global trades in currencies other than the US dollar, which the US dollar has dominated for almost a century. It started with Saudi Arabia and Russia trading in the Chinese yen, but it's developed into many countries making large trades in the Chinese yen, which is the currency backing of the New Development Bank, also known as the NDB. Now, when I called out this threat about 8 years ago, it was largely ignored. No actions were taken. Since our current administration has been in office, they've done nothing but take actions on the threats that I've been calling out. It began very first day he was elected by enacting tariffs against countries participating in de-dollarization. This was a penalty meant to deter them from stepping away from the US dollar, because it was starting to become very apparent that de-dollarization was actually working. We were seeing the US dollar slumping in global impact, and it was starting to actually affect the American economy. We're looking at it through our normal lens of inflation. And this isn't simply inflation. This is inflation compounded by the effects of de-dollarization, which is why the US dollar is quickly losing value, and we're all noticing that. Now, it didn't end there. That wasn't the only action that was taken. Also, confrontations were made around the globe. You look at Venezuela. Venezuela was helping the members of BRICS to dodge sanctions and tariffs and getting them oil and gold, and even started producing ammunition for Russia during the Ukraine war. And so Venezuela was a key component of BRICS and their agenda against NATO and the West, particularly America. As we saw, we recently confronted Venezuela, and that was something that I had called out again about 8 years ago. And now we're seeing the next step, the next logical progression in confronting BRICS, which is Iran. Iran is a threat that I've called out for decades, not just over the last 8 years, but specifically over the last 8 years with what became a very clear threat to us. I nicknamed it the open road, but it later became known as the Tehran-Beirut highway. And that was during the defeat of ISIS. Iran claimed control in the power vacuum behind ISIS, specifically across Iraq through Baghdad, Kirkuk, Abu Kamal, Deir Hazir, across the open desert, up through Homs to Beirut. And 8 years ago, when they seized all of that territory, they created a land bridge between them and their proxies, which allowed them to arm their proxies highly effectively. There were, probably hundreds, if not thousands, of minivans stocked with simple rockets. That's all it takes, to Hezbollah, to Hamas, to all the enemies of America's allies. And so that allowed them to further their agenda, which they nicknamed the Ring of Fire. The 7 proxy armies that they armed against Israel and our interests in the Middle East. Now, we started confronting that when we very gently overthrew Assad in Syria. Granted, that led to al-Jilani, but al-Jilani is no friend to Israel, no friend to Iran. And so that was the beginning of the erosion of that open road. And now Iran's access to their proxy armies has started to diminish. And that was furthered by America becoming more involved in Iraq, which then degraded their ability to transit freely across Iraq. What we're seeing right now in Iran is the culmination of the whole thing. We're beginning to confront the one force that BRICS had that was a legitimate threat to us and our interests. And we're seeing that in their strikes on the United Arab Emirates, on Qatar, on Saudi Arabia, and other allies in the region, not just Israel. And so I think a little more detail on the open road is probably necessary on this. All right, so to go into a little more detail about the current conflict with Iran, it's fairly important to give some context as to how Iran became such an imminent threat to America and our interests across, especially the Middle East. During the defeat of ISIS, a lot of territory was ceded to various different factions and militaries within different nations. And so this map here is going to demonstrate for us how Iran became so dangerous. Now, ISIS wasn't defeated all at once. It was something that occurred gradually. And so we've got Israel over here. We've got Lebanon up just to the north of that. And that's to give you some context to where the map is. As ISIS was falling, the first major city along what was the Tehran-Beirut highway that fell was Deir ez-Zor. Deir ez-Zor is on the western shore of the Euphrates River, or as people know it in the military sphere, the MERV, the Middle Euphrates River Valley. And so that became kind of the corner of the Tehran-Beirut highway. Abu Kamal, down here in the southeast of Syria, was one of the later phases to fall of ISIS. But that became a very critical passing point. And then Iraq fell because of Kirkuk. It was kind of a complicated scenario, but the Kurdish forces that were allied with America in northern Iraq are split in two. You have the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, which is mainly the southern half of the Kurdish territories. And then you have the Kurdish Democratic Party, which is the northern territories of the Kurdish-controlled zone. Now, the Kurdish Peshmerga were fighting against ISIS alongside Americans. And as ISIS began to be degraded and finally defeated in 2017 through 2019, the Kurds got a little arrogant. They thought this would be a great time to launch their independence referendum, which is something that we've always known was going to come one day. But essentially, the area that they control in northern Iraq, they wanted independence to be their own country. And so they launched that referendum, and it passed with glowing colors. It was about 95% voted yes. That was expected. This wasn't a UN monitoring vote. This wasn't one that was observed by anyone outside. So there was a lot of tampering and a lot that went on with it. Do I think it would have changed the result? No. I think it would have been passed and we should have enforced it. But shortly after the referendum, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson came out and he said, America stands firmly behind the territorial integrity of Iraq. Essentially saying, we didn't recognize the referendum or the validity of it. Now the Kurds, obviously a little upset about that, having just fought ISIS on behalf of America, they did something a little crazy. The Kirkuk oil fields here in northern Iraq are the largest oil fields in Iraq, and they were under Kurdish control after defeating ISIS and kicking them out of the oil fields. So that zone was under the direct control of the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, or Jalal Talabani's tribe of the Kurds. When we announced we weren't going to enforce the referendum and grant the Kurds their independence, it wasn't long, a few days, and the Iranian Popular Mobilization Forces, along with the Quds, their special forces, came across the border and seized Kirkuk from the Kurds and gave Kirkuk to central Baghdad, obviously the capital of Iraq. But here's the rub. That didn't really change anything, because Baghdad, the president, was a member of the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan. So the oil fields, while in the control of central Baghdad, were still under Kurdish control. But what it did do was it wrestled control from Masoud Barzani, or the Kurdish Democratic Party, which is more Turkish aligned. So when the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan gained control, that oil field became more Tehran aligned, more aligned to Iran. And they also embedded 80,000 members of what's called the Iranian Popular Mobilization Forces into Iraq as Iraqi security forces members, giving Iran full territorial control of Iraq. So that was the first step in what was called the open road. The open road came from the border of Iran right here, through Baghdad, along this major highway right here, to Abu Kamal, up the highway to Deir Hazir, across the desert to Damascus, and then up through Homs. All of these names are names that have been in the media. They're big conflicts, things that we feel like didn't go well, weapons, chemical weapons usages, stuff of that nature. And it's because these territories were so important. That is a literal freeway from Tehran, the capital of Iran, across Baghdad, through Iraq, all the way through Iranian-controlled Syria, despite the fact al-Jilani was now the leader, a Sunni who hates Iran. That maintained for about 5-6 years, and that's where we saw the flood of weapons going to Hezbollah specifically, but also to Hamas, and enabled them to launch a full-scale attack on Israel. Now, with Jilani taking over, we started to see the erosion of especially this desert area around Damascus. We saw some of his HTS, or Hayat Tahrir loyalists, taking up posts in here and starting to erode that Iranian control across there. And finally, they did gain full control of Deir Hazir. Now, what that did was mainly pissed off Iran, but then it also took away their access to their proxy armies across the Levant, or the core of the Middle East. Now, that didn't make them any less of a threat, because they still have their hundreds of thousands of ballistic missiles, their drones, and their very cheaply made improvised weapons, as they essentially are. These drones are just bombs attached to your everyday drone, and they just launch it, and it hits and it explodes. So they're very cheap and very effective, whereas what we use to intercept them is not cheap, but also very effective. So you figure you're launching a $50,000 drone, it's being intercepted by a $500,000 missile. The economics of war become somewhat prohibitive. Now, the only way to change that calculus is to go into Iran and start blowing up their stockpiles. You take out 500 of their missiles, well, suddenly it's cost effective, and we're going to win the war economically. But more importantly, Iran has been the money laundering firm, essentially, for BRICS. They've helped them bypass the sanctions and the tariffs and get the money that they have been basically incapable of getting for the past 10 years. So this war against Iran is not just a war against Iran. This is a war we've been in for about a decade now. And it's something our media and our government don't tell us about, which in and of itself doesn't allow us to decide whether we support it or we oppose it. But if we don't confront Iran, if we don't confront Venezuela, if we don't confront these proxy nations that are helping our enemy, we're going to lose the greater war, which is an economic war. De-dollarization is shrinking now that tariffs are in place, but it's still very much a threat. The American dollar is under threat every single day. And the only way we're going to win this decade-long economic war is to confront our actual enemies. Iran is critical to that. And so when you're deciding whether you want to support or oppose the war in Iran, recognize that it's not just about Iran. There's a bigger picture that is a much bigger battlefield, and that battlefield is the entire globe. So this is one piece of it, but it's not what everybody in the media and our government is saying. It's not to free the people of Iran, which I'm a big fan of, and you should be too. But that's really a side effect of the greater mission, which is winning this economic war that we've been in. We don't have the option of losing, because if we do, America will become a third world country, just like all the countries we've defeated over this past couple of centuries. And I don't think any of us want to see that. So check everything I'm saying, get all the information, learn yourselves, and hopefully you're going to come to the same conclusion I do, which is the war in Iran is very important, absolutely critical to the success of America. Thank you for your time, everyone. Have a great evening.